Hey guys, it's Jordan with TYT and TYT Politics, coming to you live from my car. Remember, I am parked. I am not driving. I know a lot of you are concerned and think I'm a maniac. I am parked. I just arrived to East Chicago, Indiana, where I'll be covering the ongoing lead crisis here that the media is not covering. It's another poor black community that has been decimated by Republican and Democrat policy that has forgotten they're human beings. So you might be seeing me more than once on Facebook today because I might try to do some of my interviews here on Facebook Live. So stay tuned for that. If you've been watching over the last few days, I was in Flint for 3 days. It's still a crisis. Don't let anyone tell you differently. They also, in addition to lead, there's bacteria in the water. And Rick Snyder, the governor of Michigan, and his cronies are not even testing that thoroughly for bacteria. It's taking private investigators and private lead inspection to find the bacteria in the water. They've said, oh, it's safe now to bathe. You got children bathing in waters and taking shower in bacteria. They also have been saying it's safe to drink the water with a filter, a government-issued filter. You going to trust your child putting a flimsy filter in the sink faucet that it's going to catch lead and bacteria? Good luck with that. It's a humanitarian crisis, and it's also kind of murder that the government is perpetrating on its people. So check out my videos, youtube.com/TYT Politics. There's a bunch of Flint videos up. We'll be issuing out more. I plan on going back to Flint as well. I want to be there longer than 3 days because it deserves a lot more coverage. But I wanted to do a video on, I always try to get across the point that do I think Republicans are worse than Democrats in most areas? I do. I don't look at the world black and white, but certainly on social issues, the Republicans are worse. And on, I think, economic issues, they're worse. However, the mainstream media paints it as Democrats, they just let Democrats feed their platitudes and bullshit, where Democrats have been complicit in a lot of these issues with the lead. And a lot of Democratic policies, presidential, governor, state, local, have also been served as, a light and a fuel to the fire. And I have an example here. So before I get to Bill Clinton, I want to put a disclaimer. I'm not blaming Bill Clinton directly for the Flint water crisis. There is no direct connection. And Rick Snyder, the governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder is the responsible party, period. Rick Snyder, who inserted an undemocratic emergency manager who was unelected. Only to answer to him, the emergency manager had the power to overrule contracts, to void contracts, to void collective bargaining. Basically, a dictator. Rick Snyder is the one who put that person in, and that person decided, oh, it's a good idea to get off Detroit's water, and move to a privatized pipeline. The privatized pipeline wasn't ready, so they did an in-between in the Flint River, which is the most toxic water you could think of. So Snyder is 100% responsible. Lauren, you're right. But I wanted to give you a different angle because Bill Clinton's policies helped lead to the Flint water crisis. I read a great article this morning. It's from jacobinmag.com. So that's JACOBIN mag.com. And the headline, I'll put the link in the video, Neoliberalism's Deadly Experiment. I'm going to read you parts of the headline. The water crisis in Michigan is also intertwined with the subprime mortgage meltdown, which is closely related to financial deregulation. In 2005 to 7, Detroit had the highest rate of subprime mortgage foreclosures in the United States, while increasingly deregulated banks were aggressively marketing adjustable rate subprime mortgages to working class African Americans in Detroit. They were also selling risky financial instruments to the city government. The Commodities Futures Modernization Act of 2000, signed by Bill Clinton, allowed the swaps market to metastasize from $180 billion in 1998 to $6 trillion in 2004 to $57 trillion by the summer of 2008. So what they're talking about with the swaps market is what the banks did. They sold off their investments in the mortgages, sold it off to investors, and then they went out and bet against the mortgages, that the mortgages would fail. So they basically bet against their own investors that they sold the crappy mortgages to. That's what Goldman Sachs did and all of them. In 2005, during this wild, wild west period for predatory lenders, Detroit entered into a $1.4 billion deal with UBS, AG, and Merrill Lynch Capital Service, later acquired by Bank of America. The deal included 2 layers of speculative financial instruments, one of which was an interest rate swap to fund Detroit's water and sewage department. The swap deal constituted a bet that interest rates would rise. After interest rates plummeted as a result of the 2008 crash, Detroit Water and Sewage Department was forced to pay $537 million in swap termination payment to banks. In order to pay the termination fees, Detroit Water and Sewage Department increased water rates and took out $489 million in further bond debt in 2012. That year, Bloomberg reported that, quote, debt service had climbed to more than 40% of revenue at Detroit Water Sewage Department. As a result, nearly half of Detroiters' water payments were going to pay debt service to banks, inflated by the bank's predatory swap deal. In April 2013, ongoing Detroit Water Sewage Department rate increases provided a public rationale for Flint's emergency manager, Ed Kurtz, to switch from the Detroit Water Sewage Department to the Flint River, although the actual reasons remain murky. So let me explain that so you understand. Why was the city of Detroit allowed to engage in speculative investments with investment banks? And why were those investment banks speculative investment where they could bet against the housing market? Why were they allowed to do that? Because Bill Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall. Bill Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall in 1999, which for 60 years, I believe, was the hallmark of banking regulation in America. It separated commercial banks and investment banks. So the two couldn't work together. As Bernie Sanders says and other progressive and sane economists say, the repeal of Glass-Steagall is what the first domino that led to the 2008 financial crash. Goldman Sachs, these investment banks couldn't have been doing this speculative, crappy subprime mortgages and then doing credit default swaps to bet against them if it wasn't for the fact that they were able to get these mortgages from commercial banks. So the city of Detroit entered the subprime mortgage mess, and they did a bet against the housing. They ordered themselves. Let me read it again. They ordered themselves so they adjustable rate subprime mortgages. So in 2005, Detroit entered into a $1.4 billion deal with UBS, AG, and Merrill Lynch. The deal includes 2 layers of speculative financial instruments, one of which was an interest rate swap. The swap deal constituted a bet that interest rates would rise. Well, they didn't think interest rates would rise. Oh, they thought interest rates would rise. The Detroit public officials and the Detroit government that betted with their citizens' money that interest rates would rise didn't know that the housing market was going to crash, thus plummeted interest rates. So when they bet that interest rates were going to rise, they were wrong. As a result of being wrong, they owed $537 million. What did they do? They hiked up water charges for the city of Detroit. They also hiked up water charges for the city of Flint. Flint, for years, was getting their water from the city of Detroit. Flint was Detroit's biggest customer. So when Detroit had this $537 million mess, they passed it off to their customers, both residential customers and other municipalities like Flint. And this gave Flint, the emergency manager, the rationale to say Detroit's gouging prices, that prices are skyrocketing. We need to get off this. Now, again, the emergency manager was an unelected, pretty much a privatized government official. He's an agent of privatization that reported only to Rick Snyder. So he's no good. And they are responsible. Rick Snyder and the emergency manager. Bill Clinton is not directly responsible. However, Bill Clinton, both with repealing Glass-Steagall, he also helped loosen regulations on derivatives trading. A lot of deregulation went under in the 90s under Bill Clinton that Bernie Sanders brought up and that Hillary Clinton tried to whitewash. Well, the city of Detroit, because banks were allowed to work and merge with commercial banks, they were able to do these shady credit default swaps and betting against their investors. And city governments were then allowed to invest and do swaps and bet against things like interest rates or subprime mortgage. And when city governments lose on a bet, who pays? The citizens. You think the citizens had a vote whether the city of Detroit could engage in bets on interest rates? Of course not. The city did it unilaterally. And Flint had a reason to say we can't use Detroit's water anymore. It's too expensive. Detroit owed $537 million. They started hiking up prices from their citizens to pay their bill for their stupid and greedy investment. And then it got passed off to Flint and other areas. So that is what happens with neoliberal deregulation. That's what happens with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Deregulate. Of course, Trump's going to try to deregulate the whole damn country and the banks. They're both awful on this. But you need to understand what Bill Clinton did. Of course, he didn't know that. I don't think he intentionally hoped that the economy would crash. He was trying to pay off his bank donors. And he was also trying to pave the way for Hillary Clinton to run a successful Senate campaign. Because I think it was their original plan for Hillary Clinton to run in 2008. So she needed to kiss the bank's ass. So how do you kiss the bank's ass? Let the wild, wild west era come back. Let the 1920s come back. Let them go to the blackjack table and gamble with our money. Well, it has consequences. The city of Detroit isn't the only one that made subprime mortgage bets as government entities that made subprime mortgage bets and credit default swaps. And when they lost, the city of Detroit paid for it. And as a result, some of Detroit's biggest water customers, Flint was the biggest customer of Detroit Water, were allowed, gave corrupt bureaucrats like the emergency manager, which was an unelected official, who basically the emergency manager was Rick Snyder, the governor. Reported to Rick Snyder. Rick Snyder pulled the strings. People I talked to in Michigan call him Dictator Snyder. So that's the legacy of neoliberalism. Policies of presidents almost 20 years prior. Deregulation crashed the economy, and then when the economy crashes, city governments were on the hook for their greedy and reckless bets. And they passed off the bill to the consumers. And then Flint had a rationale to make a radically reckless decision. But I want to make sure we're clear on something, because just because I cover the Democrats equally as Republicans doesn't mean Rick Snyder and Republicans in this particular situation are directly 100% to blame. I don't want to make it seem like I'm equating Bill Clinton with them. Bill Clinton didn't make the decision to switch to the Flint water. Neither did Hillary Clinton. I got no love for either, but I don't want to be unfair to them either. I got to be credible and equal. But his policies of deregulation, of getting rid of Glass-Steagall, allowed commercial banks to pass off mortgages to investment banks and then let investment banks go wild. Jenny, no, we can't take these people out. Nonviolent activism. We don't want to be violent. So I'm going to put this, when we put this video up on YouTube, I'm going to put the link for this article. It's a terrific article. There's also consequences that Bill Clinton's welfare reform had. People's water bills went up. People lost their welfare, so they couldn't afford to pay their water bills in Detroit and cities like Flint. So there's consequences to these actions. Again, youtube.com/TYT Politics. Stay tuned for more. I'm going to do some reporting in East Chicago, Indiana today. I'm going to try to do some of it on YouTube Live. I know it's late in the year, not as many people on the computer, but I hope you can share this video, and I hope you will watch my videos on the TYT Politics from Flint and East Chicago. Have a great day, guys.